if you can go back before 2016, you can see the fracturing of British politics, already happening. You can see Labour's vote share declining as the people that are unhappy with the settlement leaving and feeling disgruntled, and perhaps going to parties on the right as much as the left. But I think it's almost impossible to argue that Brexit, that vote in 2016, hasn't made British politics more unstable. It hasn't destabilized British politics. It hasn't made it more fragile. I think, in a sense, because it shattered permanently those coalitions that were fracturing a bit before 2016, but then have completely exploded.
No, this time a decade ago, Britain was waking up to a new reality: life outside the EU. The referendum vote the day before had ushered in a new era of politics, and we were all still trying to work out whether that was for the better or for the worse. And perhaps some of us still are. But of course, it was also just the latest chapter in our in-out, shake-it-all-about relationship with the European Union and its forerunners. That history is brought to life in Between the Waves, the hidden history of a very British revolution, by Tom McTague, who is also the editor of the New Statesman magazine, and he joins me now. Hello, Tom.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Thanks very much for being with us. So look, Tom, earlier this week, I gather, you found yourself in the garden of Jean Monnet. He's the founding father of the European Coal and Steel Community, which would become the EEC and eventually the EU, of course. What was Monnet's vision of Europe when he set out to make that community?
Yeah, it was a fascinating journey, actually, to the garden in a little village called Hugo, which is sort of in the Parisian home counties, that kind of their version of Surrey, I guess. Nice little village, and it was here where Jean Monnet had a house that he bought in 1945, and he would have all of these kind of great figures would come through his garden, from Eisenhower to Kennedy in time, and all of the sort of great figures of the French and European elite. And his vision was of a united Europe that was an equal partner in the West. Remember at the time, the big thing that hung over everything was the Cold War and the ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. And he saw the West as a civilization that was worth defending. And it was Europe on the one side and the United States on the other. And we essentially believed in the same things. And it was really important that Europe was a partner in that, and not just a kind of weak and divided place full of squabbling nations.
And look, critically, did he include the UK in that Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the interesting thing is Jean Monnet was a figure who came to prominence in the First World War when he ran a sort of a joint allied council where Britain and France would try and buy things together so that we weren't kind of competing while also in this existential struggle with Germany. And he took a lot of lessons from that, and he tried to set up the same thing in the Second World War, but France was then quickly overrun, as we know. And he came to London pretty much at the same time as Charles de Gaulle, and he wrote a memo calling for Britain and France to unite in a formal, union of the two countries. This was backed by Churchill and by de Gaulle, sent to the French government as a real proposal, and it was rejected by Pétain, who said it would be like marrying or sleeping with a corpse, that we had lost, we just hadn't figured it out yet. But he was a huge Anglophile, Jean Monnet, and as the war progresses, he is a key figure, trusted by us, the British, but also the Americans, and he originally thought that the West involved sort of three component parts. One was the United States, one was continental Europe that needed rebuilding, and the third bit of the West was the British Empire. Now, of course, as the British Empire collapses or starts to disintegrate after the Second World War, he very much sees Britain as an absolutely core part of not just the West, but of Europe. And he wanted Britain in there. And he worked his life trying to get Britain into Europe. One little tiny story for you, actually. He was in the House of Commons gallery when MPs voted in 1971 to take Britain into Europe. It was a sort of great moment of pride for him.
So, look, I mean, if he were to look at Europe today, 10 years on from the referendum, how would he regard it? Would he just regard this as a sort of an unmitigated disaster, the collapse of his dream, or would he see any kind of upside?
No, I don't think he would see an upside. He really was a huge Anglophile. Like his grandson, who I spent time with, who lives in the village where Monnet had the house, Hugo, where this grandson was born. He was saying to me that he dressed like a Brit. He was dressed on Savile Row. He was sort of known as a just an enormous Anglophile who just felt it almost like a sort of civilizational pull. That Britain had to be part of Europe. It was part of Europe, and it needed to be reflected as such. I think, though, what he would find most troubling about our moment, this moment in time, is the sense not just that Britain has chosen to leave the European Union, but the West itself is kind of pulling apart. What does it mean anymore? The idea of the West. Do we believe in it? Do we believe that we are part of a civilization that is real? That it includes the United States and Canada and Australia, but also Europe. And I think that sort of hangs over this conversation, really. The fact that, is this something worth defending anymore? Do we believe in it?
Well, I mean, so you suggest pretty clearly that Brexit fits into a wider story of Western malaise, which I guess is what you're talking about. Brexit, did Brexit sort of spearhead that decline did Britain spearhead that decline with Brexit, or had it begun before the vote to leave? Is it a current that was flowing underneath, or were we something of a catalyst?
I've thought about this a lot, and I suppose my own thinking is just as confused as ever. I think it's both. I think we're kind of a cause and a symptom. Brexit is obviously, I think, a symptom of something much bigger. It's not a coincidence that Britain leaves the European Union or votes to leave the European Union in the same year that Donald Trump is elected president of the United States. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I do go back to the end of the Cold War as a kind of as something that really significantly changes so much of our world, and the reactions to that, the sense that it robs us of this enemy, this ideological rival, and it leaves us in a world in which, for a long time we thought it was the end of history, that everyone was going to become Western in a sense, and it was the triumph of the West. And that we could, we didn't need these other institutions because everyone was moving that way. I think it feels very, very different now, doesn't it? I mean, and so I think it leaves us with this question: well, who are we? And I think that is the kind of a crunch point here. Who are we defining ourselves against, and who are we defining ourselves with? Is it with the United States, as sort of Tony Blair put in his essay the other day? Essentially, we still need to align with them, and we need to choose them over Europe. Or do we align ourselves principally with Europe? Have we become not so much Western, but European?
So, look, we've been discussing it a lot on this show whether Brexit is to blame for our revolving door of prime ministers. They've lasted an average of 1.6 years since Brexit happened, and before that, they tended to last rather longer. Is that a cause, or is that a correlation?
I think it has to be seen as a cause. I think there is a degree to which there is a kind of sense of continuity. I think if you can go back before 2016, you can see the fracturing of British politics, already happening. You can see Labour's vote share declining as the people that are unhappy with the settlement leaving and feeling disgruntled, and perhaps going to parties on the right as much as the left. But I think it's almost impossible to argue that Brexit, about that vote in 2016, hasn't made British politics more unstable. It hasn't destabilized British politics. It hasn't made it more fragile. I think, in a sense, because it shattered permanently those coalitions that were fracturing a bit before 2016, but then have completely exploded. And I think if you go back to sort of 2017 and 2019, I think a lot of us felt, oh, okay, so the Brexit referendum shattered those old coalitions, but new ones have formed quite quickly, and perhaps they're quite stable. The Conservative Party could suddenly get back above 40% in the polls again, as could the Labour Party. And then I think, though, what we've seen since is the degree to which that was never the case, or it was more fragile. People had left their old tribes, and they were much more likely to sort of jump around between them since. And fundamentally, I think the country is unhappy because we have not replaced in any sense an economic model that works.
Understood. Look, Tom McTague, absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much for being with us yet again. The book is Between the Waves, The Hidden History of a Very British Revolution, 1945 to 2016. It's available to order at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can get a 20% discount. Just visit timesbookshop.co.uk. Tom McTague, always a pleasure.